Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome to this webcast on Brexit, an update for musicians, delivered by the ISM Trust. I'm Naomi Bath, Senior Research and Policy Officer here at the ISM. I have my colleague Maria Visitu here with me, who is going to introduce the webcast and ask me some questions about the latest Brexit developments and what musicians might expect in the coming months.
So, welcome. Before we begin, a few technical points. You can't see us, but you should be able to see the PowerPoint presentation. The content of this presentation is for information purposes only. It is not intended to be a substitute for other professional advice and should not be relied upon as such. You can contact us about your specific situation, and if you require legal advice, ISM members can contact the ISM legal team. We hope you find this information helpful, and we will also be making it available as a podcast on the ISM website.
Great. So if we start with what I'm going to cover in this webcast, first we're going to look at the political situation and how things currently stand with the timeline of Brexit. We're going to look at what happens after Brexit Day, what happens after the transition period, what is likely to change for musicians touring in the EU from January 2021, what musicians can do to prepare for after the end of the transition period. We're also going to look at what the ISM will be doing regarding Brexit in the coming months, and also how musicians can get involved with the campaign.
And firstly, what is the political situation following the general election, and how do things currently stand with the timeline of Brexit?
So, as we all know, at the general election, the Conservatives won with a large majority. Boris Johnson, as Prime Minister, has a majority of 80 MPs, which has made it very difficult for the opposition to make any changes to the Brexit bill. So the Brexit bill, which is officially called the Withdrawal Agreement Bill, has gone through the House of Commons and the House of Lords and has been given royal assent. So what this means for this week is now the UK has ratified the Withdrawal Agreement Bill, the EU will ratify it on the 29th, and the UK will officially leave the EU at 11 p.m. this Friday, the 31st of January, which we know as Brexit Day. So just in terms of what might happen on Brexit Day, we know that on Friday Big Ben won't be chiming, but that there will be some sort of clock to count down the hours until we leave the EU. And it has also been reported that the Department of exiting the EU will be closed down.
What happens after Brexit Day?
Okay, so on the 1st of February, we enter the transition period, which lasts for 11 months until the 31st of December. So these 11 months of the transition period are absolutely crucial because that's all the time the UK has now to negotiate a free trade agreement with the EU before the deadline of the 31st of December. This is a really challenging and ambitious timeframe, and many people, including the President of the European Commission, have said that 11 months to negotiate is impossible. But nevertheless, the Prime Minister has ruled out any extension to the transition period, and there is a clause in the Brexit bill making it illegal to extend. However, there is still technically the possibility to repeal that law if, for example, the negotiations are not progressing well. So it may still technically be possible to extend the transition period if the EU agreed before the 1st of July this year. But aside from all these dates and technicalities, the most important thing to remember about the transition period is that during those 11 months, UK citizens will have the same rights as before, and they can travel and work as before. This is because the UK will effectively stay as part of the single market and the customs union during this time. So the only real difference during the transition period is that the UK will have no members at the European Parliament, MEPs, and it will also be outside EU political institutions. But this shouldn't really directly affect UK citizens on a day-to-day basis.
Then what happens after the 31st of December 2020?
Well, we don't really know what will be negotiated and agreed during the transition period, but the government's task is to agree some form of trade deal or free trade agreement by the end of December. So this may be a very reduced kind of bare bones trade deal covering only trade tariffs. Or it could be a comprehensive agreement covering mobility and security and all sorts of other things, although this is generally seen to be unlikely. It is also possible that even a bare bones trade deal won't be ratified by December, in which case the UK would still crash out without a deal altogether. And if this happened, then the ISM's no-deal Brexit advice would mostly still apply. But if we assume that the bare bones trade deal is ratified, it's important to note that this would be a very basic deal. It would only cover trade tariffs, and it's unlikely to sort out provision for the movement of people or goods in the EU. And these issues would most likely be negotiated on a bilateral basis with each EU country. And unfortunately, these are the most important arrangements that touring musicians need to know. So the trade deal for us is only helpful to a point.
Okay, so what could change for musicians touring in the EU from January 2021?
So the first thing that will change is the rules for travelling to EU countries to work. So you may see the introduction of visas and work permits. We have tried to get clarity on what this might look like from DCMS and the Home Office, but so much really depends on the outcome of the negotiations. Our recommendation at the ISM is for musicians to have a 2-year multi-entry touring visa that is cheap and admin light. The second thing to change is the rules for taking instruments and sound equipment to the EU. So there's a lot of confusion about how musicians based in the UK will be able to transport their instruments into the EU from January 2021, given that there will be new customs arrangements. There's uncertainty about when and how to use carnets, oral declarations, merchandise in baggage rules, and EORI numbers, and how they will work in practice. So we are campaigning for a simple and effective customs mechanism with the EU that will allow easy and cheap temporary transportation of instruments. Another big part of how the rules for taking instruments into the EU will change is through CITES regulations. I'm sure you're all aware, but CITES stands for the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. So this affects musicians who have any endangered species in their instrument, like ivory, tortoiseshell, or Brazilian rosewood. If musicians have these kinds of instruments, then there will be changes to how they can be transported. And this is because the EU will no longer be part of the customs union, so we expect that CITES will treat the UK as a separate entity. Musicians will need to get a CITES permit, known as a Musical Instrument Certificate, or MIC, to show they are transporting their instrument legally. It is also likely that there will be restrictions to which ports and airports musicians can travel through with these items. For example, when the government was preparing for a no-deal Brexit, Eurostar wasn't made CITES designated, so a musician with ivory in their violin bow wouldn't have been able to travel by Eurostar. So the third type of thing that might change is a series of existing mechanisms and procedures that protect musicians working in the EU. If we look at social security payments first, there is currently an agreement throughout the EU that means you only pay social security payments to one country. In the UK, we pay national insurance if we're registered to work here. Musicians fill out an A1 form to exempt them from paying any additional social security payments to other EU countries they work in. However, after Brexit, we don't know if this agreement will hold. When we were facing a no-deal Brexit in March and October last year, France said that they wouldn't respect the exemption, and so musicians would be liable to pay in France as well as the UK. This is something called double deductions, which the ISM has been campaigning against. Other mechanisms are things like healthcare provision and driving. So if we take healthcare in the EU, we don't know what's going to happen to the EHIC scheme. This is the European Health Insurance Card. If this scheme ends and no equivalent is put in place, then musicians would need to purchase private travel insurance, which includes health cover. For those musicians without any health conditions, this is relatively cheap, around £70 per year. But for anyone travelling with a pre-existing medical condition, like diabetes or Crohn's disease, travel insurance with health cover is much more expensive. And just briefly on driving in the EU, if musicians drive themselves to the continent to perform, then they may need to investigate an international driving permit, which can be bought from the post office. So the fourth thing that will change is the rules to copyright. So the European Parliament voted last year to adopt the EU Copyright Directive, which will transfer copyright liability from users to internet platforms, something that internet platforms like YouTube and Google have been staunchly against. So the music sector has been lobbying for the UK to adopt the Copyright Directive into domestic law after the UK leaves the EU, because it would help to protect musicians and creators, giving them rightful payment and protecting their work. However, it was just announced last Friday that the UK will not adopt the EU Copyright Directive, which includes the more contentious Article 13, and this is very disappointing for musicians and the ISM.
What can musicians do to prepare for after the end of the transition period?
Okay, so musicians should try to keep aware of all of the issues I've just raised and look out for how they develop during the negotiations. They should keep checking the ISM Brexit Advice Centre for up-to-date information, and if they are an ISM member, they can contact us directly with queries. But in terms of specifics, there are already a few things to keep an eye on. So the first thing is to check your contracts. The ISM is aware of recent cases where EU promoters and agents have introduced additional clauses into contracts with musicians to shift responsibility regarding cost to the musicians themselves, things like additional costs incurred for paperwork or any travel delays. So we strongly recommend you get advice on the implications of any additional clauses in your contracts. And ISM members should contact the in-house legal team in the first instance. You can contact them at legal@ism.org. Another thing you can do to prepare is to get your musical instrument certificate, your MIC, as soon as possible. So if your musician contains any CITES materials, as I said before, like ivory, tortoiseshell, Brazilian rosewood, you are likely to require a MIC to travel to the EU after the 31st of December. So we're aware that a charge for a MIC is likely to be introduced in early 2020 for the coming months. So we would encourage you to apply for your MIC as soon as possible while they are still free of charge. And we have more information about this on our website. You should also be aware of CITES designated ports when planning travel or tours in 2021. So we know it's not yet clear what will happen in relation to the UK and CITES, but it's certainly possible that some ports and airports will not be equipped to manage CITES inspection procedures. And we know this from the government preparations for a no-deal Brexit, when Eurostar and Immingham were not made CITES designated. So it would be wise to keep an eye out for planned changes to any CITES designated ports after December 2020. And a useful one for all of us is to check your passport has at least 6 months validity. So we know that free movement is coming to an end in December, and the rules regarding mobility will change. So we don't quite know what these will be yet, but the government advises having at least 6 months validity on your passport.
And lastly, what will the ISM be doing with regard to Brexit in the coming months?
So, as I hope you are aware, the ISM really works tirelessly to keep up to date with the government's Brexit developments and make the case for musicians to government so we get the best deal possible. We are launching the next ISM Brexit survey in early February, i.e. in the next week or so. So please do complete it. Please share it with all the musicians, directors, agents and promoters that you know and work with, particularly those who spend time working in the EU and abroad. This gives us better data to analyse so we can produce really robust research. Also, please do sign up to the ISM's Save Music campaign to stay informed. The Save Music website has lots of ways you can get involved and have your say. And one particularly useful resource you can find on the website is a template letter that you can use to write to your MP. So please do look when you have chance. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Naomi, and if you have any questions, you can send us an email at membership@ism.org. Thank you very much for listening.